Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Dr. Topher Endress, who has a book which is about to be released by Westminster John Knox Press titled Accompanying Disability, Caretaking, Family, and Faith. Topher is Associate Minister at First Christian Church in Columbia, Missouri. He has helped coordinate the annual Institute on Theology and Disability since 2018 and does additional consulting for faith communities who seek to become more integrated and inclusive of diverse abilities. Topher earned an MDiv from Vanderbilt Divinity School and a PhD from the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, and was ordained by Disciples of Christ. Despite stints in Tennessee, Texas, and the UK, he considers himself solidly Midwestern, having grown up in Evansville, Indiana. An avid runner and Lego builder, Topher enjoys exploring the trails and wilderness of Missouri with his wife and their sons. He has a passion for disability inclusion and justice and loves dreaming with churches and ministry partners on ways to become more people. You can learn more at firstchristian.org or wjkbooks.com. So Topher, congratulations on your new book, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm very grateful to have been asked to have an interview with you.
Well, I was looking forward to it. Thought your book was a great topic and a great book. So, and most anything that uh, Jessica Miller Kelly edits is bound to turn out to be wonderful. So,
She is a fantastic editor. Yeah.
yes, yes. So, is there anything else you'd like people to know about you than what I kind of briefly touched on there?
Yeah, I think it's helpful for anyone who's maybe watching this interview online, and if you are low vision or blind, physical ID. I'm a white man wearing clear glasses. I've got shaggy, dark brown hair with lots of gray in it, and a dark beard with also lots of gray in it. And I'm wearing a gray T-shirt sitting outside on my deck because it is a very lovely day here in central Missouri. Um, I've also done, in addition to some of the consulting work and ITD, the Institute on Theology and Disability, I've helped kind of launch some intentional living communities for folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities and students. And I've done some ministry work directly. So I've touched on disability, not just in the ways that I talk about in the book in terms of my family and some of the ministry work, but just in general. I have a lot of touch points with disability, which gives me hopefully a really wide angle lens that I try and bring into this work.
Cool, cool. So, the Institute on Theology and Disability, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's a wonderful conference. It's I kind of think of it as this really big umbrella conference where it links together social researchers, theologians, faith leaders of all stripes of every religion and denomination, uh, general just interested parties, and people with and without disabilities who fall into any and all of those categories. So you'll get theologians interested for the first time in concepts of disability, and also disabled theologians, disabled faith leaders also trying to become better allies and learn more about what this world looks like. And so
Mm.
by putting all of those people into one room, getting those conversations going at different tiers and different levels, you really produce these fantastic conversations, really rich, fruitful conversations where theologians are attending to direct church members, or faith practitioners are learning from people in wildly different contexts. And so it's a wonderful opportunity. This year, I sadly won't be able to make it in person, but there is a hybrid option. And they'll be in Denver from, let me get these dates right, June 16th through 18th. So it's well worth it. There are some other great conferences as well. ITD is probably the most wide-ranging one in terms of who it invites, but there's also the Disability and the Church Conference with Key Ministry in late April, early May, and that'll be in North Virginia, just outside of DC. I'll be able to speak there, which I'm grateful for. And Western Seminary has their disability consortium in July 12th. July 12th, yeah. So there's lots of great opportunities, ITD and beyond, for continuing education and learning if this topic is something that you're interested in.
And the last one takes place at Western in Holland, Michigan. Is that correct?
That's right. And I believe it's a one-day conference, some of which might be accessible online. They do a lot of hybrid education, especially around disability theology. So it's a great thing to check out if you only have kind of a really short window for some
Mhm.
continuing ed opportunities.
Good, good. Well, let's get to the book. As I mentioned, the title is Accompanying Disability, Caretaking, Family, and Faith. So can you tell us how the book came about?
Yeah, so really this book was, it's the long form version of some notes I scribbled down at one of the ITD conferences. And the first chapter has this section where I talk about sharing my father's story and his journey of becoming disabled. We were hiking together in Tennessee. He fell, he broke his neck, suffered this spinal cord injury, and became a quadriplegic. And while I was at an ITD conference, I ran into another theologian who had had an incredibly similar journey.
Hmm.
They were injured within 24 hours of each other. They were
Oh,
about the same age, very similar, very active, sporty, uh, fathers who were injured in these kind of shocking freak accidents. Um, and as I was conversing with this man, he was asking all these great questions about my experience as someone who accompanied my own father, and then used that story as part of his keynote later in the
hmm,
week.
hmm.
And and he did so well-meaning, not understanding that that wasn't a story that I had really shared in that context before, and that wasn't a story that my father was comfortable with, um, because it wasn't my story to share, and yet it is my story. And so it raised all these great questions about who owns a narrative and what does it mean to be transformed meaningfully by someone else's journey. And because he used that publicly, what responsibilities and roles did I have to play in safeguarding somebody else's story? So that's the
Hmm.
questions that germinated this novel, or this memoir, I guess. And as a result, I wrote this short form essay that I only gave just to my dad, nowhere else. And he read it, and his response was, I never wanted to talk about my accident. I never wanted to share my story, but now I feel like I actually do want to, and I actually can. And so that's where
Wow.
this book jumped out and said, okay, what if we write this together and you share your story and I can offer some of these back end reflections and these bigger philosophical, theological questions?
Very cool. Very cool. So now that it's done, who would you say that the book is most intended for?
I think I wrote it, it sounds selfish to say I wrote it for me, um, but I certainly wrote it for people who were in a similar situation of primarily Christian adults caring for their older parents, the caretakers and the people who are accompanying their disabled family members or close friends who just need a little reassurance that they're not alone in the way that their life is being shaped, that their journey is similar to somebody else's, even if the details don't align very well. There are so many people living longer and longer, and as we live, we know we will eventually age into some disabilities. We'll age into impairment, degenerative disabilities like Alzheimer's or dementia, loss of hearing, loss of eyesight. Uh, these are things that more and more people are experiencing. And as a result, we've got a whole generation of folks who are learning how to be caretakers, not only maybe for their children, but concurrently caretakers for their adults, their parents or grandparents. And I think I wrote it to them just to say, you're not alone. These are hard questions. It should be transformative. That's not always easy. Sometimes it transforms you in ways you don't like. Um, but maybe there's some good here. Maybe there's something we can learn together by exploring this one particular story and letting it expand into other people's lives.
Hmm. Cool. So you mentioned that in the book you have some of your father's writings alongside, some of your own. Can you talk about how you chose to do that and how that ended up working out?
Yeah, it was a fun process. So, my parents were really invested in my education growing up. They were hands-on parents, so they are the ones who taught me how to read, how to write. And in this process, I was sort of editing my dad's writing and telling him like, oh, I don't think that word means what you think it means, or, oh, that's not how you use a comma. And it was sort of this like, ooh, but you're the one who taught me how to use a comma, so I don't know if this is okay. Um, so we wrote it together. He used a program called Dragon, which is
Yeah.
a voice capture software, and so um, it would very regularly pick up random words that were being said across the house or would misinterpret. So he needed somebody there to be able to write and fix as he went. Um, it was also just this interesting process of he would say something and try and say a sentence and then say, ooh, I don't know that I like that, or I don't think that's really true. Let me go back and fix that. So it was kind of, it almost felt invasive at times to be that close to somebody trying to process out their own story. Um, but it was this really cool process of getting to see my father work through and try and remember and recount these things that were important to him. Um, we had initially planned on him writing out kind of all these different sections and fully writing them and editing them himself. He passed away in 2019, so we
Oh,
were only partly through. He had the outlines. He had most of several of these sections fully written and edited, and there were some sections that he knew what he wanted to say. He had notes, but they just weren't coming together. And so I had to kind of update those and fill them out. Some of them are shorter than I know he wanted, but I didn't want to overwrite his own sections. And my mother wrote uh, with us in this process. She also did a lot of editing. And so, it was really a family affair. And one
yes.
of the best important things that we did was when he was first injured, we started a caring bridge, a website where you can, kind of blog about someone's health
Mhm.
journey. And my dad was able to give us a lot of information directly through that. So we had this record of his
Mm.
thoughts in the midst of it. And that was really helpful for us all to go back and say, well, you said that about this therapist, but actually, you know, if you look back 5 years ago, whenever you were first interacting with them, here's what your thoughts were.
Mm.
So it was good to have those records.
So did you write kind of like different sections based on what he wrote, or are they more independent from each other?
They started as I'm going to write reflections on what you're writing, but because he died kind of too early in the process, we had to transition to a different style, and it became less about I'm going to reflect on your writings and more about I'm going to write my experience as this caretaker figure and allow your writings the space in between to kind of inform and reshape the narrative for the readers so that what they're getting is sort of these two concurrent pictures that hopefully give a really expansive and in-depth look at the relationship by allowing both sides of that relationship to speak kind of at once.
Mm.
So even the structure of the book, initially the writings were integrated and there would be paragraphs and reflections in the chapter itself and then split voices. And we had to transition that back out and re-separate them and say, well, this is just John's section. And so that's why you see in between every chapter, you've got my voice and then a completely separate section of
Mhm.
John's writings.
Mm.
So some of it is planned, some of it is just because you adjust based on what capabilities people have. And if they die in the middle of a book, you've got to figure out a way forward.
Yeah, yeah, wow. So the book's description says it offers a compassionate, faithful model for nurturing relationships with loved ones with disabilities. Can you talk a little bit about that model?
Yeah. So I think the model works in a couple of layers. The first layer is just sharing one another's stories and believing someone else's story as they share it is the first way that we can model for ourselves this compassion and allow other people's lives to influence our own. It's a layer of humility to let somebody else dictate their own life and let it transform us. I think on a more practical, specific level, what I've tried to do is separate them into major categories, almost like hermeneutics or lenses that you could study your own relationships with. And so I've done that through, I kind of title them narrative, time, economy, history, space, and performance. And I think that all of these are ways of looking at a relationship. You can look at the performance aspect of the relationship you hold with your parents and what roles are you expected to perform? What roles are they expected to? And what does it look like to disrupt those roles? How do you both handle that? And by looking at it that specifically and that lens or that hermeneutic, it allows you the freedom to kind of study it a little more in depth and to come to some of these conclusions about, oh, yeah, whenever we do change that performance aspect, whenever the people who gave me care are now receiving my care and I'm thrust into this different role that I perform, here are the ways that it's uncomfortable. And here's how we can process that together. And so you can do that with all of the other kind of categories, the disruption of time and expectations, the ways that we narrate who we are and what these relationships are together. So I think if you go through the book and if you read each chapter and think through those particular lenses, it forms this nice model for you to approach how you would understand at a deeper level those relationships. But it really is all couched in that expectation that you can give one another that humility to lead their own lives and that you will believe them and choose to follow instead of dictating what it must look like. So I think that's kind of the model that I'm trying
Wow.
to express.
I love the way you separated out into those different aspects, and then kind of did analysis and reflection on each one. That makes a lot of sense. So I'd like to read from a couple of the endorsements of the book. This one is from Bill Gaventa, founder and director emeritus of the Institute in Theology and Disability. He says, this book highlights both grittiness and sublime and can be read by anyone. Can you talk a little bit about the grittiness and sublime that you discuss?
Yeah. So this is where it got really tricky and where it was so helpful writing while my dad was alive and able to give me feedback because disability is inherently a gritty topic. It is difficult. It is challenging. Um, there are so many wonderful, generative, transformative things about the concept of disability, but that doesn't mean that disability is not also really, really hard. And it's also necessarily embodied. And so when you're writing about things like your disability experience and you're talking about like you've got a plan to put your Johnny boy in your backpack so that if you need to empty your catheter bag and there's no accessible bathroom, you have a way of emptying that urine that's in your bag. Otherwise, it can back up and cause UTIs. That's not a fun topic, and that's also kind of embarrassing for some people because that's not a common topic. We don't talk about, urination in public usually. I have a 4-year-old, so we do talk about that because we've got to learn, what's socially acceptable. Um, but things like that where that is part of the experience and naming the checklist that you have to go through of you need your wallet, you need your Johnny boy, you need these types of wipes, you need, for some people they might need to pack things like Depends or, disposable underwear if that's something that their body doesn't give signals that they need to use a bathroom. That type of grit is necessary for people to know and to understand. And I think, one group that I didn't talk about that this book is also for would be faith leaders who need to know how to support caregivers and disabled people better. And knowing some of those details, some of those more intimate and gritty details about what the physicality of disability can look like are really helpful, because otherwise they don't get named. And
Mhm.
so bathrooms don't get prioritized for accessible spaces in churches. And we don't think about, maybe we need a hardwood floor or a vinyl floor so that when they're parking, if their catheter's leaking, it's not getting on the carpet. Right? Those aren't conversations that are happening in most churches, but those are the gritty details of disability experience that um, both disabled people and caregivers and accompanists experience on a daily basis. And that's just one example, of course. Disability is so diverse and so different case to case and person to person. So I don't profess to be able to speak to the disabled experience, because that is not a thing. It's not monolithic. But I do think all of them share that embodied grittiness. Um, but the sublime aspect of it is that we're human. We're meant to be gritty, right? We're meant to have physical features and to exist in a physical world. And the materiality of the body is not just grit, but it's also beautiful. And when we can name how God is present and how the Spirit is present, even in conversations around an accessible bathroom or around, you know, emptying a catheter, those conversations, when they invoke the Spirit, can become beautiful and allow us to see that our grit and our embodied physicality is not separate from the work of God in our lives. And so I think that's what needs to be said more and more often, so that we don't feel the need to hide some of those disability experiences away and not bring them in fullness in our worship and in our faith lives.
Yes, yes. So here's another snippet from an endorsement. This one's from Amy E. Jacomer, author of Redefining Perfect, the interplay between theology and disability. She says, Endress introduces the term accompaniment theology as a distinct branch of disability theology. So can you tell us a little bit about the accompaniment theology?
Yeah. So for context, accompaniment theology really comes out of the um, Latin American Catholic liberation stream of theology. And there is so much uh, just poignant, beautiful writings about the importance of inhabiting our bodies, inhabiting our space, and acknowledging the ways that the body of Christ is a physical body that inhabits space. And so that's a lot of the work that I've done, tries to translate that sort of accompanimiento theology into a disabled context, because there's so much overlap um, between the two. So I have a little snippet from page 132, if I can read
Sure.
that. I think that kind of explains what it looks like to accompany the body. And so I write, in the truly inclusive church, the bodies of those who do not move on their own, bodies like my father's, ought never be expected to bear alone the weight of an actively moving spirit. When we gather in all of our diversity, attentive to the ways that God has moved in each other's lives, we accept the potentiality for the Spirit to, in real time and among real life, accompany us in such a way as to transform our individualities, communities, and entire world as we produce space along those on the margins. Following God, the accompanists, the caregivers, the parents and siblings, the people who care deeply for a disabled person, seek a solidarity that mirrors God's willingness to die a grotesque death on the cross. God did not come to earth as a symbol of every person, but as a person with a particular set of features and connection to the political, economic, and social world that forms the boundaries of our definition of disability to begin with. And what I think that encapsulates is this mindset that um, by living life so immersed with one another, and by acknowledging that the Spirit is present in those relationships, in that grit, and in the challenge and in the mundane, we begin to see that we are accompanying the true body of Christ and are accompanied by it ourselves. And so it's this reflexive relationship. We aren't doing anything uh, so outlandish and amazing by simply accompanying one another, because we're receiving just as much as we're giving. It's not a charity case. It's this relationship that is not just between you and another person, but invokes this third presence, the presence of the Spirit. And so by being in relationship, you are transformed, you are changed. It becomes your narrative and your life, uh, by virtue of connecting you back with God's body. And so we've got to remember the physical reality of Jesus, the physical death of Jesus, the physical presence of the Spirit in us and among us. And that allows us to view this accompaniment, um, not just for our social, placement, but for the relationships that we hold and dive into.
That's very helpful. I mean, I hadn't thought of it myself exactly that way, so I appreciate that. So, kind of stepping back overall, what would you like readers most to take away from the book?
Yeah, I think it depends on where you come into the book, and what your context is. If you're someone coming who is fairly new to the concept of disability theology, I hope that you are getting some of this sort of underlying foundational theological workings that help you to broaden your horizons and to seek out some other more explicit uh, theological interventions. If you're somebody who is disabled, I hope that it comes um, as a reaffirmation of your experience, that it doesn't strike you as like wildly off base, but also clues you in to the people who are providing care for you so that you can be in a deeper relationship with them. And for the caregivers, the accompanists, I hope it is a balm of some kind, just an awareness of I'm not alone. This is hard, but it's also beautiful, and there's a lot of meaning and joy in the midst of this, even when there's hardship and challenge, and I don't feel as alone as I do this. Um, I can't come to people's house and tell them to go take a nap while I do their laundry and wash their dishes because I know they're burnt out and they're tired. But I can share a story and tell them that what they're feeling is not just normal, but actually it's good, and it can produce in us this deeper appreciation for one another and for the Spirit's work. So I think those are the things that I hope it hits, and hopefully that resonates with at least a few people out there.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm sure it does. So, this is your first book, at least in terms of a trade book. What advice do you have for others who are kind of embarking at the same place in their journey?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I'm the one who should be giving a lot of advice here, but I would say that what really helped me in writing this was writing different styles of going through academic papers that I had to publish, writing a PhD thesis, writing sermons for my church, writing newsletter articles, writing blog posts, just getting a lot of different things out there that all require a little different voice, a little different tone, different word choices. Um, it gave me this kind of expansive understanding of, oh yeah, okay, I can't just throw out a 10-syllable word when I'm doing a sermon because one, I won't pronounce it right, and two, no one will know what I mean. And so just the practice of different types of writing. So if you're going to write a book, go write a bunch of sermons, even if you're not sharing them. Yeah, I think it's a really helpful practice to develop more of that conversational tone, uh, to be able to break things down in a way that people don't have to constantly be flipping through footnotes and a thesaurus and a dictionary because they're not doing that in the pews. And to think about being able to translate your own writing to different contexts, I think really helped me as a first-time author here. Because when Jessica came back, my editor, and she would say, this section needs work, it's too academic, or this section needs work, it's just not good. It gave me a sense of confidence that I could at least approach changing it, and that I wasn't sort of pigeonholed into one style or tone, that's all I knew. So yeah, write lots and lots of different things, and that way you can diversify.
I think that's great advice. So I know you're in the midst of, launching a first book, but I have to ask, is there any future books or projects that you'd like to tell us about?
So I don't have anything in the works right now. I've got two young kids and a church that I'm helping lead and this book. And so there's just a lot going on that I'm kind of waiting until this calms down before I start putting more writing out there. But one of the really big questions that I hold that I really want to get into, and maybe from an academic side, maybe from a more accessible trade book side, is thinking about vocation and what we're called to and how we're called to share and use our gifts in community with particular respect to intellectual and developmental disabilities,
Hmm.
and thinking uh, particularly about disabled leadership. What does it look like to put boundaries around appropriate, healthy, responsible leadership that don't draw those lines along maybe an IQ test? How do we acknowledge and identify the gifts and fruits of the Spirit that might lead people into leadership capacities that don't look like most ministers or faith leaders have historically? I've really been impressed and challenged and blessed by my engagement with a lot of folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities and the way that they approach, not uniformly, of course, but some of the ways that they approach these questions around who God is and what that means for us in radically different ways than uh, what I've really experienced in divinity school or in a PhD program. And I think there's something really worthwhile in that question. So I don't know exactly what it will turn into, what style of book or what style of writing, but I think that's a question I really want to sink my teeth into. The other thing is that I would like to, after this book is published, translate it into an easy read version for folks who maybe don't process um, written word at the same level as what it's written for. So the PhD thesis has some of the same theological kernels. I might publish that in the future, and then this book, and then maybe an easy read version that's really accessible, maybe even to children, and to allow them to deal with some of these questions at a developmentally appropriate level. And that one would have pictures, which would be fun.
Well, very cool. I'm glad you have so many good ideas. It'll give you plenty of runway for future projects. So, Topher, thanks so much for joining us. Many congratulations on the new book. Again, the title is Accompanying Disability, Caretaking, Family, and Faith. And you can learn more at firstchurch.org and wjkbooks.com. So, Topher, thank you again.
Thank you so much, Brian. I appreciate it.